familiar with the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm here to talk to you today about loving yourself as your neighbor. No, I didn't mess that up. I meant to say that. Maybe that's not what you were expecting to hear. I ask you to stay with me. How many of you have either heard or said yourselves, I struggle with pride? Can I get a show of hands? I know that I've said this as well. I've heard this countless times in different Christian contexts that I've been a part of. In today's church, we are convinced that pride is one of the top issues that we struggle with as a community and as individuals. And yes, prideful behaviors are rampant in our world. But I believe the root of that problem is actually the exact opposite. As Christians, we do not know how incredibly loved we are, and that God responds to us with kindness and compassion. And because of that kindness and compassion, we can offer the same kindness that we offer to our neighbors, to ourselves. So let me unpack this for you for a bit. Scripture tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. In fact, this is the second greatest commandment, second only to love the Lord your God. And it's a beautiful commandment, and one that is a driving force of the Christian life. Well, at least the second driving force of the Christian life. However, I think that we have misinterpreted this command to mean that somehow loving our neighbors means that we must despise ourselves. This charge to love others means that we must destroy ourselves in the process. We berate ourselves when we make mistakes. We verbally assault ourselves in our own minds when we don't meet a standard, whether that's our own, God's, or man's. We have become our own worst enemies. We speak and respond to ourselves worse than we would respond to any human being, even our worst enemies. If we treat ourselves the way we would treat others, then I think we would see something very different. If the way we treat ourselves is the measure by which we must treat others, well, then the standard for loving our neighbor is pretty low, wouldn't you say? And so I suggest, in order to get that second commandment right, we may need to reconstruct our own attitudes, postures, words, and actions towards ourselves to look more like how we would treat our neighbor. Now, I may have just lost some of you. You may wonder if I'm taking too much license here with Scripture, or promoting selfishness, or saying that it's okay to put others down for our own benefit. And let me be clear, I'm not saying these things. What I am saying, though, is that we have a certain voice with which we speak to ourselves. And the more I have talked to friends, family, coworkers, and the many women and men that I work with on a day-to-day basis, the more that I would say that this voice that we have internalized is one of shame, condemnation, and insult. We have become our own enemy. The internal voice that we listen to about ourselves speaks to us in a way that we would never, never, never dare speak to another human being. Not our worst enemy, let alone our neighbor. We have emphasized in our Christian character development the importance of being kind to others and have lost the ability entirely along the way to be kind to ourselves. Within the field of psychology, there exists a school of thought called dialectical behavioral therapy. Within this area, we learn of a term called self-compassion. Psychology and theology meet at this beautiful juncture. We learn to have compassion for ourselves as we learn to speak to ourselves the way we speak to others, or the way that others speak to us, or better yet, the way that God speaks to us. Now, don't get me wrong. I am an enthusiastic proponent of caring for others. I do it for a living. Caring for and loving others is one of the strongest motivators in my life. I spend the better part of my day doing so. However, I am utterly confused at the way we have lost the ability to turn that kindness in on ourselves, that we are somehow excluded from the compassion, love, and kindness that we are commanded to give others. Time and time again, I sit with young adults, men and women, who are seeking growth in their lives. And they think the answer to their growth is try harder, do more, do better. You're not good enough. I watch as we, yes, myself included, toil and strive for perfection. And here's what I see. It's just not working. The change doesn't come. Frustration lingers, and we're stuck. These words that we speak to ourselves will never have the power to transform us. They only have power to keep us stuck and afraid. If we are to pursue real growth and change in our lives, we have to go about it in a very different way. We need to model after the way that we would treat others, and ultimately, again, how God treats us. It's hard for me to imagine that this is what God has for us, right? This way that we speak to ourselves in condemnation. I don't believe he has condemnation and shame for us. I believe he has a different way. I witness in myself and others the harshness in which we speak to ourselves, the way that we constantly berate ourselves for mistakes, shortcomings, sin issues, and areas of growth. We ask ourselves, how could you do this? Are you even a Christian? You're disgusting. How could anyone love you? You can't do anything right. Do these sound familiar? These questions, these accusations? Can you think of a time recently when you maybe accused yourself with these words? This is what I'm talking about. We have become our own enemies. We hurl insults at ourselves. We live in discouragement, disappointment, and degradation. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. I spoke with a young woman recently who was feeling anxious about her future. She was so racked with anxiety and knew that anxiety was not what God had for her. The fear and anxiety was taking over her. And not only was she experiencing these thoughts and feelings about her future situation, she began to feel frustrated at herself for being anxious to begin with. And so the questions and accusations start. How could you be anxious? How could you not trust God more? What kind of a Christian are you? How are you ever going to be a Christian leader? And now, this young woman is nice and stuck, paralyzed by fear and shame. Here's another example. I was meeting with another young woman not too long ago who shared with me that she was struggling with sexual temptation and sin. Her immediate thoughts and beliefs about herself include the following. You are dirty. How could anyone want you after this? There's no way that you can be a Christian leader now. God doesn't want to hear from you until you get this together. And how will anyone ever respect you as a Christian woman? We do this with all sorts of things, big or small. Just yesterday, I spoke to myself this way when I was just a few minutes late to church. Were those few minutes really worth that kind of condemnation? We are never good enough, and the constant message in our heads is one of disgust, despair, and discouragement. I asked these same women that I just told you about what they would say to their friends if they were struggling with these same things. And like magic, the entire mood and tone of the conversation shifted. You could just feel it in the air. Instead of shame, I started hearing messages like, it's understandable why you might struggle with this. I'm sorry this is so difficult. I understand. God does not condemn you for this. He loves you, wants to help you change. Have you ever spoken those words to someone else? What was the result? I imagine it was a wonderful thing to see. And what is even better than imagining what you would speak to someone else is imagining Jesus in the room and what he might say or do. That's the really beautiful part. I wish you could see it. You see, what we are talking about here is learning how to interact with ourselves the way that God interacts with us. I think we have taken the command so seriously to love our neighbors that we have forgotten that the measuring stick is the way we love ourselves. It is not one or the other, either or. It's both. We have been operating in a zero-sum game. If I offer compassion to someone else, that means there's none left for me. Or maybe it's vice versa. If I offer compassion to myself, then there's none left for someone else. In the end, it must equal out to zero. Or I want you to envision a well that you would go to draw water. If I draw water for someone else, then I don't get that water. Rather than operating out of that zero-sum game, what if we imagine that well had enough for all of us to go around? There's always enough. Offering compassion to ourselves does not take away from what we are able to offer others. In fact, it fuels it. The more we can experience this for ourselves, the more we are able to offer it to others. What if we began to speak to ourselves the way we spoke to others? Or the way others speak to us? Or better yet, the way that God speaks to us? For many Christians I have encountered, and most of you here listening, you are incredibly kind, empathic, and understanding to those around you. I've seen it. Even when they mess up. It's almost easy for you to show compassion and kindness to those people. Yet there is this massive gap between what we are able to show others and the judgment and shame that we offer ourselves. This voice of love that we give to our neighbor, and what I would argue is the voice of God through us, is far more compassionate than we dare to compassion towards us. I know what some of you may be thinking. If we just offer empathy to ourselves, how will we ever change? So let's go back to these women that I was telling you about. Offering empathy to these women is not the same as saying that nothing needs to change. We confuse empathy and compassion with being stagnant or making excuses. These are not the same things. Empathy does not equal excuses. When we can offer empathy and compassion instead of criticism and condemnation, we have freedom to pursue the growth that we seek. The time and emotional and mental energy that we have spent berating ourselves in our own minds is time and energy that we could spend towards actually changing. Isn't that amazing? When we can offer empathy and compassion instead of criticism, we have freedom to pursue growth. Let's go back to this pride issue that we started with when we first started talking together. I believe that once we speak to ourselves the way that God does, we no longer have the need to ignore our shortcomings, to self-promote, or exert our significance over others. There's no need for that, you see. Instead, we would get a true picture of our belovedness in the midst of our shortcomings. We would operate out of an abundance rather than a scarcity. What we don't know is that we don't have to try so hard to receive kindness. It's there for us. God offers it freely. We offer it freely to others. Now we just need to offer it to ourselves. So let's start here. Instead of constantly berating ourselves and hurling insults and judgments on ourselves, could we actually seek to hear and understand what is going on the way that we would with our neighbor? Instead of asking, why did you do this? In that accusation, could we actually ask the question, so why did you do this? What's going on for you in this? Did you hear that difference? Let's actually ask the question as a question and not an accusation. Asking the question in gentleness and kindness as Jesus would ask it. There's freedom and creativity to understand and then move forward when we can learn to talk to ourselves this way. And this is just the beginning of the process. We're just getting started. So come with me as I learn how to speak to myself the way that God does, the way that I might to my neighbor. And maybe just maybe, as we learn to love ourselves as we love our neighbor, we might actually be free to do both.